What's up, everybody? I'm Stan, and welcome to Detail Comics, where we go over comics in detail. This is Shelf Appeal, the weekly Wednesday show where I go over the comic books I pick up at the comic book shop, give you my impressions on what they're about, and whether there's something you should go back to the comic book shop for or not. So make sure to subscribe to get more of these every week. The first comic I want to talk about is Amazing Spider-Man Renew Your Vows number 12. So this is a book that's got Ryan Stegman as the writer, and it's really going to be his last issue on this series that he helped start with Jerry Conway when Marvel Now 2.0 was really rolling out. So as we kind of jump into this story, this is really the finale of this particular arc where we deal with Normie Osborn, his creation of a giant, spider family fighting robot that has the powers of Regent and the ability to kind of suck those powers out of all the individuals. And that means that when the X-Men show up in their, in their Blackhawk, it just, well, not Blackhawk, their Blackbird and their Blackbird jet. So when the X-Men show up, it absorbs all their powers. So now the Spider family is fighting all of these particular characters, all the powers of these individual people. And that even includes, like the ability to suck out Spider-Man's powers, so the only person left is Spiderling. And this is her moment to shine and become a hero before we transition to 8 years from now when Jody Houser takes over the book in, the next issue. So overall, I was really happy with the way this goes. It wasn't necessarily the kind of expectations that I had for the series when it started, but overall, I can definitely see that, it's really had a good run up to this point, and I can't wait to see where we go when it comes to having a slightly older, kind of like early teenage year Annie Mae Parker, and how her family, how Peter and Mary Jane have really progressed in their lives over those 8 years. There has to be some sort of character progression in order for this to be a valuable transition, so I'm really excited to see where they go with that. Of course, the next book that I want to talk about is Wonder Woman number 32, so this continues the Children of the God storyline by James Robinson, and what we see in this book is that we have the continuation of the story of Hercules, and he has bequeathed everything that he has for worldly possessions to his sister, daughter of Zeus, Diana. So, she's kind of in this situation where she's out hunting parademons with Steve and, a lot of people that we saw in the Wonder Woman movie. And what happens is that, she doesn't really find the answers that she's looking for until she meets back up with the lawyer and the executor of the estate of Hercules. They travel out to his cabin. She sees all of his best, his trophies from his various endeavors, his tasks, his Herculean feats. So she goes through all these kind of things, and she finds a clue of the long-lost twin brother that was alluded to at the end of Darkseid War. And for the first time ever, by the end of this book, we actually see the introduction to Jason. So I really wanted to like this book a lot. The only problem that I found was that the script felt a little clunky in places. It seemed like it could have used another pass-through as far as the editing's concerned. The art was good, but the premise of the story really wanted to make me read it, and I'm willing to give it another shot for another issue or two, but it just felt like it wasn't quite 100% on this point in time. Like, it just felt like it could have gone through the editor just a touch more to kind of nail down those final pieces, because the final interaction between, when Diana really comes to see Jason as he's out in his fishing boat, it just, like I said, clunky. It just feels a little clunky, like it didn't quite mesh as well as it could have. But overall, the book still has a lot of promise. After Wonder Woman, we're going to talk about my favorite character, and that is Amazing Spider-Man. And Amazing Spider-Man 789 sees the fall of Parker, that arc start up. And what we find is that Peter is pretty much a loser. He has been on Bobby Morse's couch for the last month. He has not gone out into the world, and Dan Slott just really drives home the point that everyone in the world hates Peter Parker, so the only place that he has left that he can kind of call his own is Spider-Man, and even that is tainted by the legacy that he's left as Peter Parker himself. Even his friends, his close friends, even out of context, they do feel like he's a little bit on the pathetic side, or, it would be kind of insulting to do some of these things. So we see the progression of the relationship between Peter Parker and Bobby Morse. We see him try and get back into the saddle as Spider-Man, but ultimately there's a very serious destruction and character, I wouldn't say character assassination, but public perception of Peter Parker as an individual is really in the toilet at this point in time. I'm interested to see how Dan Slott is going to play this, because he essentially gave Peter Parker everything and then took everything away from him. And man's not a yo-yo, dude. So it's just one of those things where it's like, I really had high hopes for where this was going to go, and I'm really interested to see how he progresses at the Bugle when, when he, the editor finally calls him about this new position, probably. But that's like 2 issues into the future. Right now, it's just like, oh man, it's like a high wire act without a net. and Dan Slott's kind of teetering. So, not necessarily for everybody. Spider-Man fans are not necessarily going to find anything brand new or exciting about this story, other than the fact that their hero now doesn't have the money to back up everything that he's been doing, and is just kind of like really sad and feeling sorry for himself. Then we go into another conflict, but this one's really more about family, and that's in Action Comics 989. So the lenticular cover, you know, we got some Jor-el, we got some Kal-El. So in Action Comics 989, we see that the plot, the motivation for Jor-el is not necessarily to kind of cause Clark to abandon all hope in humanity. Really what he's doing is he's setting up distractions, he's setting up progressive measures so that way he can keep Superman distracted, because he knows that he can't easily convince his son based on how his actions are. However, the person that he can convince pretty easily is his grandson. So this slimy bastard of a dad is just, he's there to manipulate and control and, you know, like try and drive his grandson, or, you know, this entity, you know, who's masquerading as Jor-el, is trying to drive his grandson to kind of enlist his father, or, you know, convince his father that this isn't necessarily the place for him because there's a better world out there for him that we don't even know if it's real or not. And so it's just, you know, he's preying on the weaknesses of a kid, and based on the storyline that's going to be following up after this and where Superman's going in the main title, I really don't think it's going to get that far, but it's definitely going to have a serious impact on Superman based on the future arcs that are going to be going on in Action Comics. But I'm really interested to see how this one kind of plays out. I think we've got 2 more parts to this. So Action Comics, must read. I really don't like Jor-el. Or whoever's controlling or portraying Jor-el, really do not like that character, which I believe is the point. Of course, the 1-2 punch of Oz stories wouldn't be complete without talking about Detective Comics 966. So Detective 966, A Lonely Place of Living, is really the story of Tim Drake, and it's just all about Tim Drake. If you've read, I think it's like, you know, Titans of Tomorrow, that's when Tim Drake, you know, this is pre-New 52, early Teen Titans. In that story, he was introduced to Tim Drake Batman for the first time, and it was a really dark future that he was hoping to avoid, and this is that same Tim Drake. Even references to Connor Kent, you know, are in there based on these entire things. So it's very interesting to see how, you know, Tim versus Tim really plays out. One person is obviously a manifestation of the future, and it's even reflected in the scarring activity that goes on in this particular book. But it's just one of those situations where, you know, there's an actionable item for this Tim from the future, so that way he can go out and he can succeed where he has failed so many times before. You know, even with his vast intellect and his abilities and you know, everything that comes from being Batman, he hasn't been able to succeed until now. So Tim is scary as a Batman. You know, he's extremely capable. You can tell that James Tynion IV is a real fan of Tim Drake. You know, this is like a love letter to Tim and Tim's future, and how impactful he is on the Batman mythology as a part of the Bat family. So Detective Comics 966, even though it's a secondary story about Oz, it's really about Tim. It's really about, you know, Batman, the essence of Batman, the essence of the character of Tim Drake. It's Tim Drake's story wrapped in an Oz you know, like an Oz burrito full of Tim Drake. So it's really a good story. Definitely one that I recommend picking up. It's going to give you a little bit of insight onto other things, but it's really key for those people that are fans of Tim Drake to really catch up on this one. Very much a good story. Highly recommended for me. Of course, there is another book that's highly recommended for me, and that is Mr. Miracle #3. So Mr. Miracle is ridiculous. I have no good words to describe Mr. Miracle other than it is scrambling my brain. I am not really up on my fourth world mythology, you know, the whole New Gods aspect that was created by Jack Kirby, but overall, you know, you see some very key characters in here. You know, you've got another appearance by Orion, you've got Light Ray, you've got an absolutely brutal first 3 pages of this particular comic book dealing with Granny Goodness and her final kind of, well, her finality at that point in time. It's just absolutely insane. I mean, I will never hear the words Merry Christmas in the same way. It is like, you guys voted. I'm going to be doing a review on Mr. Miracle #3, and even if you guys didn't vote for it, I probably would have to do it simply because there's just way too much for me to unpack in this particular video, and it's just that crazy. Man, I love it. I love it so much. I recommend it to anybody that was, got any kind of interest in a really offbeat story that, kind of messes with your mind. Highly recommended from me. Of course, I did have to make a determining choice which one I was going to read first, so I decided to read Mr. Miracle first, but Metal number 3 came soon after that, and with Metal number 3 comes a whole heck of a lot of stuff. Just like everything else that goes on with Scott Snyder books, there's a lot of density as far as, what comes in terms of information. So we find that it's been 7 days since the invasion of the Dark Knights. Superman has been captive. He's been fighting Barbados for years, lifetimes it seems, and all of these battles seem to have the same result. Superman ultimately loses. So when he's finally captured by Wonder Woman and then, brought out so that way they could go run away, so that way they could confront Barbados in a very different way, Superman immediately bolts, heads to Gotham, almost gets into a serious debacle, ends up being saved by Dr. Fate, like a lot of other people from the Dark Knight's crossovers, or the one-shots that have been happening so far. So Dr. Fate is playing a key point, not necessarily as, like a savior of this particular storyline, but he's a nexus point. He's bringing everything together so that way the heroes can act accordingly in this kind of scenario. They end up at a lost bar outside in the magical dimension, and then, they have each individual places where they have to go in order to fight these various villains, these villainous versions of Bruce Wayne's Batman. And then Superman makes the ultimate decision to go through the Phantom Zone, which is a parallel kind of world, almost like with a soft barrier between the dark multiverse, and then ultimately ends up next to a withered and dying, it seems, Bruce Wayne Batman. But that was his ultimate folly. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on in here. I'm going to do a review on Dark Knight's Metal number 3 so we can get into a lot more detail on that too. So definitely stick around for that. It's just, there's so much insanity going on in Metal, I can't even really relay it. It's awesome. Then we have God Complex. So God Complex number 1 is coming from Image, and this is a story about a near future kind of like sci-fi scenario. And what we find is that there's this the substrata, and then there's the upper area where a lot of people live. You've got a Trinity, which is believes in a singular God. It's a play on religion, and then what really comes down to it is that you have these gods like Hermes, Apollo, Zeus, these kind of characters that aren't necessarily actual gods. However, their access to the stream inside the substrata makes them like gods because they have the ability to enact, interact, and manipulate this various stream of information. And it's a really interesting concept as far as the whole situation goes. It's just that it's really kind of offbeat. I'm not necessarily sure how to process it at this point in time. It doesn't necessarily... as for a first issue, it doesn't grab me with the concept, which is really what a first issue should do, but it's interesting enough for me to possibly go back for issue number 2. If it doesn't really get me with issue number 2, I can totally see throwing this by the wayside. It's not necessarily like it's a bad book. It looks really good, and the concept is interesting, but it's just, it doesn't necessarily have enough to pull me in to make me enamored with it or make me really go out and spend my hard-earned money on that particular book for any length of time. Another thing that I kind of run into is that I was going to be really excited for the Family Trade number 1, but when I got to the Family Trade number 1 after reading everything else that I have, I got to the art style. The art style is good. It's familiar. It's very much like Jeff Lemire and Matt Kint's books and stuff like that, like Department H or it's got that kind of watercolory vibe to it, and that's pretty cool. The only thing that we run into is that it made it really tough for me to get through. Not necessarily the art style, but the writing of it, the way that everything was presented. I mean, it was really heavy on the exposition towards the early part of the book, and that really took me out of everything. I'm going to have to reread it again, at least go back and read the portions that I didn't necessarily make it to, because it just... It hit me with the information in the wrong way at the wrong time. I don't know what it is. It's not necessarily that it's bad. I'm sure that there are a lot of people that are really, that really enjoy it. It's just that for me, the way that everything was presented, I feel like you started to information dump on me a little bit too quick. That's the only thing that I could really find fault with. I'm going to give it a second chance just to make sure, but it's not something that I can really recommend at this point in time. However, if you are into off-the-wall crazy, I do have a book for you. And that is Atomahawk number 0. So this thing is gigantic. It's super odd format. It's kind of like AD After Death in terms of its size. But man, this is absolutely ridiculous. So this is a collection of stories that were printed in Heavy Metal magazine, and it's called Atomahawk. So this is the story of the Cyberberserker and the kind of atomic displaced god that embodies the Atomahawk. And the Atomahawk only has one thing that it wants to do. It wants to cut shit in half. So this is the story of like a Cro-Magnon man from the ice that has picked up this fallen god Tomahawk and is now proceeding to feed this dark god. So this Tomahawk lusts after like power and crystals, and the role of the Cyber Berserker is to be his tool. And you get towards the final end. I mean, it's got a collection of like various tattoos that people got when Heavy Metal Magazine was printing this, and people got tattoos of it, and the various art pieces, the concept art. So it's a really cool collection of the history behind the Cyber Berserker and Atomahawk. But what it comes down to, it is just like these. The catchphrase is like, ah, fuck. And that's the catchphrase of every single villain that Donny Cates puts in there. So this gives you that kind of flavor, this Donny Cates flavor. So, if you've read God Country, this is the same writer who's writing this. He wrote that. He's writing Doctor Strange coming up. He's writing Thanos coming up. So it gives you a different side of his characters and how everything rolls out. I really enjoyed it. I don't necessarily know if I can recommend it to everybody, but it was just kind of a really fun ride on a very unique art style. So Atomahawk #0, very cool kind of book. Go check it out if you have the option to, just to see if it's something that might, kind of catch your eye. But he's going to be rolling out more stories for Atomahawk, so definitely something I want to make you guys aware of. But those are all the books that I picked up this Wednesday, so I want to know what you guys grabbed too. So if you grabbed something different, hit me up in the comments down below. Let me know what what it's about and what you liked about it, so that way we can continue the conversation. Plus, let me know what you think about the books that I bought too. So if you like what you see, hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to get more news, reviews, and commentary on comic books, comic book movies, comic book TV shows and games, and anything and everything inside the world of comics.